It's such a delight to introduce you to Paulo Ribeiro. Some of us know him already. We who have our lunch discussions on Thursdays, we miss you. You used to come more often, but now you're very busy, which we appreciate. It's such a delight to know that we have people like Paulo who are growing into ethical leadership and will one day be leaders, perhaps here at the New York Society. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for you to meet a very ethical, intelligent, witty, what else did you tell me to say? Wonderful young man, Paulo Ribeiro.
Morning, everybody. So we actually had music from 2 game soundtracks being played today. There was The Legend of Zelda, which you just heard, but there's also a new game that just came out a couple months ago called BioShock Infinite. And the main theme for that is Will the Circle Be Unbroken? So, different lyrics, obviously, but, you know, this does fit in that. So there's a number of different dimensions by which we can look at video games. We can look at the content of video games. We can look at the business practices of the game developers and the publishers. And we can also look at the interactions. How do people who play video games interact with one another? Which in many ways is really not all that different from looking at any of the ethics in any other media. So one of the first things to look at is what kinds of electronic games are there out there. The first video games that really came onto the market back in the 1970s were what we would call console games. In other words, they're on systems that are specifically designed for playing video games. And then with the introduction of the home computer, you began to see computers appearing, or video games appearing on computers as well. And as internet connections got faster and browsers got better, you've also seen a number of games coming onto internet browsers as well. So you can play things as simple as solitaire all the way up until, very sophisticated action-adventure type games, all right from your own internet browser. And then there's also mobile games, which have become very popular in the last few years as well. So now you can just play games right there on your cell phone, whereas in the past you would have to buy some sort of portable console device like a Game Boy or a Nintendo 3DS or PSP. And games, one last thing also is that those big action-packed games that tend to be on the console systems, those are typically referred to as AAA games. So that means these are ones where they're expecting to sell millions upon millions of copies, and they tend to be rather expensive, usually running about $60. And so, one of the things that we were just talking about was the effects of the internet on games. I remember when I was a kid, if you wanted to be able to play a game with another person, they had to be sitting in the room with you, playing on the same TV as you. And so that created a certain ethical dynamic. If you acted like too much of a jerk, they could just slap you in the back of the head. And that dramatically changed once things started to shift online. Suddenly you were sitting in your own room, typing in the keyboard, and that dramatically changes your relationship with people. Also, the way in which games were distributed changed dramatically as well. So a lot of times, independent game developers now will be putting their games out online, and then people can download those through their consoles or through their computers, as opposed to having to go out and buy a copy somewhere in a store. So it's opened up a lot more possibilities for new types of games with really new and interesting ways of doing things. So let's look a little bit at positive effects. So there's been a lot of research indicating that video games are actually really good at improving visual acuity, reflexes, fine motor skills. And so you can see some of that here. And there's even been a study that's shown that cognitive improvement occurred in seniors who had played an online game called World of Warcraft, some of you may have heard of. There's been no indication of cognitive improvement for everyone else, however. In fact, I can attest to. But video games are basically a constructed reality. Video game developers will sometimes refer to this as the magic circle. It indicates a place where the normal rules of life don't really apply. And as such, it gives game developers an opportunity to create some sometimes very sophisticated reward systems where you do a particular action and you get a particular reward, and sometimes you get a reward just for nothing, and that can be very addictive. It's easy to get really roped into that type of thing. Excessive video game playing can easily interfere with our responsibilities and our relationships. I can personally attest that when I was 17 years old, I had a very short-lived relationship that was in part due to my obsession with a certain video game and my girlfriend not being terribly appreciative of the amount of time that I wanted to devote to it. Another example, a few months ago, there was a father in China who was so fed up with his son playing online games that he contracted cyber hitmen to follow his son around in these games and repeatedly kill his character over and over and over again. Thereby forcing him to go out and get a job. I don't think it actually worked, but he gave it a shot. In Asian countries like China and Korea, there are special government-funded facilities for treating video game addiction. Video game addiction has been the cause of divorce, and there's even reports of a suicide, famously, by a player of an online game called EverQuest, and the deaths of at least 2 children as a result of parental neglect caused by video game addiction. Most famously, there was an incident in South Korea where these parents had just recently had a child, and they would leave the infant all day in the apartment, feed it once in the morning, and then go and play video games at the cyber cafe all day. And the child died, and ultimately went to prison for that. So video games are designed to be engaging and to hold people's attention. It's one of their main purposes. So for those who have trouble suspending or delaying gratification, it can be very destructive. And by the way, casinos now are more and more often employing video game developers in order to design their machines for that reason. So also, since video games first came out, there has been all sorts of stigma and social controls with them. The first instance of people complaining about violence in video games actually came in 1976 with a video game called Death Race, which allowed the player to basically drive along a little car and run over little stick figures. There was a lot of concern in Japan in 1979 over Space Invaders. It was thought that this was taking up way too much of people's time, and it was inherently destructive in that sense. And then in 1981, Fernando Marcos actually ordered the destruction of every video game system in the country, in the Philippines, because he got complaints from teachers and parents saying that it was destroying the morality of their children. There's also, go back one second. So there's also quite a bit of censorship that goes on in other countries to this day. Many of it is not all that different from other forms of media. So for example, in Germany and other Central European countries, it's illegal to have games with swastikas or direct references to the Nazis. This is most relevant for World War II games. There was actually recently an issue in South Korea. There's a new game coming out that's a naval battle game taking place during World War II, and there was a number of South Koreans who were very upset over the Japanese ships having the rising sun flag. They didn't have a problem using the current Japanese flag, but they had a real issue with the rising sun flag because of the atrocities that were committed against them by the Japanese. China has also banned a number of video games that depict China in an unfavorable light, particularly ones that involve war between the United States and China. Middle Eastern countries have banned a number of different video games for showing, quote, violence against Muslims. We'll get into that a little bit later with some of the shooter games. And so in the United States, this is how we regulate games. We have the ESRB ratings. A recent study has shown actually that game retailers are actually really good about not selling games to children if they're not appropriate for children. However, that being said, the average age of a game purchaser is 35 years old, indicating that people who are actually doing the buying of the games, the violent video games that children are playing, are actually the parents of those children. I remember one time when I was at a GameStop where my friend was working, and a father came in, had a child who was probably about 6 or 7, and he said, he's playing this violent video game all the time, I don't know what to do about it, what we want to do is get him another game that's slightly less violent and just sort of slip that in and let them play that all the time. As opposed to just sort of setting some boundaries, they just wanted to replace it with something else that would be equally addicting. So some commentators have questioned the motivations and biases behind public officials and experts in which games they take aim at. Critics of video game violence will often cite games like Bulletproof, a game put out by rapper 50 Cent, and the Grand Theft Auto series, but not games like these. Violent video games in which players play as American soldiers engaged in state-sponsored killing of undesirable elements such as enemy soldiers or terrorists, they say, represent a form of violence that society deems to be legitimate over depictions of violence in American cities that is seen to be promoting social disharmony. A 2008 MIT study found that 30% of people 16 to 24 had a more positive opinion of the Army as a consequence of playing the immensely popular Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. In fact, the Army has sought to capitalize on this by developing their own game called America's Army. One of the most interesting aspects of America's Army that I've read in various textbooks is the fact that in America's Army, it's a multiplayer game, and both sides think that they are playing as American soldiers. So Team A is playing the game, and they see themselves as American soldiers shooting at terrorists. Team B is playing the game, and they see themselves as American soldiers shooting at terrorists. So for all this work that we've done, trying to build up this idea that we are fundamentally different, from our enemies, we end up playing a game where we are simultaneously playing as the enemy and as us. And so my reasoning for that is that brass blocks the flow of irony to the brain. So one of the main questions people have about video games is, do video games cause violence? And the short answer is no, but with some caveats. So the research tells us that there's definitely correlations between violent video games and aggression. This usually involves something like having a test group play violent video games for a period of time and then measure their violent tendencies afterwards, usually involving people a blast of loud noise or a dose of hot sauce, and the hotter the hot sauce and the louder the noise, the more it indicates how aggressive you are. And they've shown that there are small spikes in aggression within a period of time after playing video games, or violent video games in particular, I should say. There's been other studies, however, that also show that it's the competitive aspect of video games that is really important in determining violent behavior afterwards. And that cooperative games, even violent cooperative games, don't show the same sort of rises in aggression as other games. This study had players play the highly competitive and violent video game Mortal Kombat, seen here, Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, and then playing the cooperative but also very violent video game Left 4 Dead 2, where players worked as a team to defeat cities full of zombies. They found that increases in aggression went up with the more competitive game, but changed little with the gory but cooperative game. Other studies have gone further, suggesting that these cooperative violent video games actually have beneficial effects with people. There's also been some studies showing that novice video game players, people newly introduced to violent video games, show the Lady Macbeth effect. So the ouch, damn, spot, ouch. They have a sense of guilt that is absent from players who are more experienced in playing violent video games. So really I could go on and just show all sorts of clips from various violent video games and really kind of drive the point home. But I want to show just one in particular, which outraged even a number of people who generally tend to defend the more military-based games. It's from a game called Call of Duty 2, or Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. The game features a level in an airport, and basically you're an American who has infiltrated a Russian terrorist group. And so this scene is at the airport. I've actually cut the video early. I'm going to let the sound run a little bit longer. So the objective for this level of the game is to go through the security checkpoint, through the duty-free shops, to the gates, and out onto the tarmac, just killing as many innocent people as you possibly can. In the end, you're ultimately gunned down by your own group that you're with, and the level ends. This is rather distinct from, say, a game like Grand Theft Auto, which gives you the ability to sort of go on these mass rampages of killing innocent people, but it's not actually required that you do so. This is a rare example where, in order to progress through the game, you actually have to actively murder innocent people. Of course, as vile as this scene from Call of Duty is, one of their main competitors, EA, has gone a step further. A New York Times online article in the days following the massacre of Newtown highlighted the fact that Electronic Arts, while promoting its new game Medal of Honor Warfighter, featured on the game's website a list of partner companies. Among them were a number of arms corporations with links to their full catalogs of assault weapons, knives, scopes, and other accessories. After people complained, EA removed the links, but the partners continued to be present on their page. One of these partners, Magpool, recently had a giveaway of gun accessories on their Facebook page in conjunction with the National Rifle Association. So while the NRA may criticize violent video games as a cause of gun violence in America, they are actively involved with partnering with violent video game publishers to market guns to use. An increasingly common feature of modern action games has become the moral decision. The moral decision is a moment where a character can either do something considered to be merciful or compassionate on one hand, or ruthless or evil on the other. Moral decisions can also involve a situation where there is only enough time to save a single person, and the player has to choose between them, as in the example provided here in the video game Mass Effect. I'll also say in Mass Effect 2, I actually wanted to show a clip of this as well. I couldn't really find any, but there's, to give you an idea of an example of a moral decision in Mass Effect 2, you are making your way through a building and you come across a soldier from the other side, and he says he'll make a loud noise and get all of his friends to come. So at this point, it's moral decision time. And so you can either choose the good choice, which is to just knock him out, or you can choose the bad choice, which I accidentally chose when I was playing, which was to push him out of the window. And these different moral choices usually affect how exactly the game is ultimately played, different types of events that will come up, and how other players relate to you. So here's an example of the illusion of moral choice. Tom Bissell, author and video game commentator, recently discussed trying out a game called Splinter Cell Blacklist at the E3 video game convention in Los Angeles. This is from last year. The main character, lead spy Sam Fisher, operating in a generic Middle Eastern country, has to, quote, enter a tent, kill 2 gentlemen, and grab a third. Sam asks this third gentleman where a certain colleague of his might be. The gentleman declines to answer, so Sam sticks his knife into the gentleman's clavicle. The gamer is then given an on-screen prompt to twirl around the controller's joystick, which in turn twirls around Sam's knife in the gentleman's wound. The screaming gentleman gives Sam the information he needs, and suddenly, it's moral choice time. For Sam has to choose whether or not to just knock out the tortured victim or to kill him. Let's review. A moral choice after an interactive torture sequence. In the hands of talented game developers, however, video games can actually be used as a means of exploring different types of ethics and ethical dilemmas. Certainly when I was growing up as a kid, ethics were a big part of the games I was playing. Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Brothers, as we mentioned here, generally tended to be sort of your classic good versus evil, big little guy versus the big guy type of things. But sometimes they can be a little more ambiguous than that. A great example is the 2007 game BioShock. And the protagonist finds himself trapped inside an underwater city that was founded by a Russian-born industrialist named Andrew Ryan, who wants to create a place where innovators would not be bound by the moral constraints of what he called the, quote, parasites. So in this case being the government and the poor. Anybody have an idea of who this might be based off of? What's that? Exactly, Atlas Shrugged. Andrew Ryan is the person's name. So. Ultimately, though, his objectivist paradise descends into a world of horrors. So now I'd like to turn from the subject of violence to the subject of gender and sexism. So take a look at the protagonists here from a number of different popular video games. Can you give me two things that all these individuals have in common? Male. That's good too. I didn't hear anybody. White. They are all white, or at the very least, some of them are not actually white, but at the very least they've been given very Caucasian features. Yes, exactly. Non-white characters and female characters are actually very rare in video games. Minorities typically fall into common cliches. Characters of African or Hispanic descent are typically shoehorned into one of a few regular tropes. Arabs are almost exclusively used as villains, and in spite of the fact that they make up a huge portion of the global video game market, Asians and Asian Americans are wildly underrepresented. Right now, I'd like to take a look at some of the more famous female characters. So on the left, we have Princess Peach from the Super Mario series. She typically gets captured, waits around to be rescued. The one in the middle is Princess Zelda from The Legend of Zelda. In most of the games she's featured in, she typically gets captured and waits around to be rescued. And Sonic the Hedgehog, Mario's Sega competitor, didn't get a female character until the arrival of Amy Rose in Sonic CD, long after I had already stopped playing that game series. Featured on the right, and her role was to get captured and wait around to be rescued. Now, to be fair, each of these female characters have, in their own time, had opportunities in their games to do things, but for the most part, they are essentially an object to be reclaimed from the bad guy. But it's not all damsels in distress. Here are some other famous female characters. And as you can see, they also have quite a bit in common. I actually chose the less risque pictures, so I could have picked things a lot worse, actually. So this cartoon here actually depicts a lot of the choices that you're typically given in a video game where you have a choice between a male and a female character. The person down here at the bottom says, "Are you kidding me?" And it's typically true. This is pretty much exactly the kind of thing that you'll see in a game where you have a choice to pick between your characters. But it's not all bad. Every once in a while, we do get a strong female protagonist, such as female Commander Shepard from the Mass Effect series, and Samus from the Metroid franchise. But I should note that the female Shepard is not the default character in Mass Effect. You're normally playing as the male by default, and her scenes play out pretty much exactly the same as his do. At a video game convention called MagFest last January, I attended a platform on diversity in video games. It was there that I discovered the issue of how more inclusive representation of video games has really become a major issue in the last year. Anita Sarkeesian, a blogger and game enthusiast, has developed a research project centered around examining the portrayal of women in video games. She provides extensive documentation of not only the pervasiveness of the damsel in distress, but also something called girlfriend in fridge trope, where the male protagonist's primary motivation is to seek revenge for the murder of his girlfriend or wife. Another disturbing theme she looks into is male protagonists at some point in the game being forced to physically attack or kill a female loved one. In other cases, female characters will ask the protagonist to put them out of their misery, and are often thank them for doing it. So a recent debate about this has started with a new game called The Last of Us. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic America. We follow our hero Joel through a devastated world as he escorts a teenage girl, Ellie, to her destination. Again, the girl is an object to be safeguarded. Later on, she will be captured and we will have to rescue her. This scene here is an example of the girlfriend in fridge trope, which that is Joel's daughter Sarah in events that take place 20 years before the main game. And this scene is incredibly well done, and you can just see, based on the visuals, the development that has been made in video game technology in the last few years, how incredible the facial expressions are here. This is an example of a game that was incredibly well done. All of the characters, even the female ones, are very, very well developed and fleshed out as their own unique, distinct personalities. But nevertheless, it is still continuing the same kinds of tropes that we see over and over and over again, not just in video games, but in movies, comic books. And Sarkeesian herself found herself the target of intense misogyny when she launched this Kickstarter project last year. She raised over $150,000 from more than 6,000 supporters for her research project. She also raised some of the most vile abuse in the gaming community ever seen against her. Her YouTube channel and Facebook pages were filled with hateful comments, which is regrettably predictable. But beyond that, hackers tried to take over her Twitter feed. A web browser game was created that let players punch a picture of her, which would then develop welts, cuts, and bruises. Her Wikipedia page had to be locked by the website owners after repeated vandalism and the display of pornographic pictures. And worst of all, she personally was sent violent threats and, in some cases, cartoons depicting herself being raped by popular video game characters. This kind of behavior is only the most extreme example of abuse and sexual harassment that female gamers face on a regular basis. Another incident that got a lot of coverage last year was the so-called cross-assault debacle, in which a female gamer on a web-based game show was the target of a barrage of sexually aggressive comments from the coach of her team. In footage, she could be seen trying to make light of the comments and nervously telling him that he was being creepy, but he was completely unrelenting. When she formally complained about her treatment, anonymous online commentators accused her of liking the attention at the time. As I said, in the world of online gaming, with Xbox Live and the PlayStation Network and the myriad of online PC games, women gamers regularly face sexual harassment. For example, in many virtual games with millions of people playing online within a single game, men often play as female characters. I've done this myself. The vast majority of female characters that populate these worlds are in fact male players. While you never really know what the gender of the person is for sure, sometimes you can tell just by the username they choose for themselves. For example, a male player is unlikely to choose a name like Diva Lady 32, Korean Mommy, or Lady 619, which are all real handles used by a group of women who have started a Facebook page called Real Women of Call of Duty. A few years ago on the massively multiplayer game EVE Online, I met a GIRL, that's girl in real life, who told me that she was harassed so regularly by male players that she actually had to petition the developers of the game to change her name to something that was less obviously female. But women gamers are starting to fight back. So there's a new blog called, and I apologize for the name, fatuglyOrslutty.com, in which women submit screenshots of the abusive comments they've received and the usernames of the men responsible. The website's name comes from 3 typical forms that online insults take. Quote, you play video games, so you must be one of these 3 things. So here are some of the examples on the website. I have pretty much chosen only the cleanest ones that I could find, which gives you an idea of how awful some of these things are. Did your husband install a TV in the kitchen? Get back to the kitchen. You're a girl, stop playing video games because you're an idiot and you suck at them. You know, all sorts of really charming stuff. I check back every now and then hoping that maybe someone will have provided something that's at least somewhat clever, not surprisingly, it's never happened. If the game community wants to continue being relevant in an increasingly more inclusive world, then it needs to walk itself back from the hormone-fueled male teenage adolescence that has dominated the culture since its emergence. And the pendulum is starting to swing back. Outrage over hate speech over the last year has prompted big names in the industry to come out and take this issue seriously. What you see here is a piece from a website called gamersagainstbigotry.org, which is calling upon people to sign a pledge and then share it with their friends, encouraging them to take greater steps to be more careful in what they say online. And this isn't really just a question of gender and sexuality, it's also a question of just general cyberbullying, which has been an issue not only in video games, but just on the internet in general. I mean, anyone who's ever read an article on a blog or on New York Times or something, if you scroll through the comments page, you quickly realize that people sort of throw basic levels of decency right out the window. Another example in which progress is being made, the Eurogamer Expo has announced that it will be discontinuing the use of what's called booth babes at their next convention in 2013. So a booth babe is a scantily clad woman who stands next to a display of some sort. You also will see those types of things at car shows and different types of trade shows as well. And at this year's Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, these issues were really being talked about. So here's an example from David Gator, who is a famous writer for a game called Dragon Age, which was also one of the first games to allow players to have the opportunity to pursue gay relationships, which was really groundbreaking there. So he says there should have been much more focus on making sure straight male gamers were happy. And then he says, it's ridiculous that I even have to use a term like straight male gamers, when in the past I would have only had to say fans. And that's mainly to reflect how much the demographic has shifted in the last few years. During the conference, an International Game Developers Association party featured several scantily clad female dancers, prompting two developers, including the organization's chair, developer Brenda Romero, pictured here, and board member Darius Kazemi, to announce that they were resigning. Later that week, Romero spoke on a panel with 6 women in the industry where she sounded off against the aforementioned booth babes, used at the larger gaming convention called E3, which just recently happened, and their disrespect to female gamers and developers. A number of the developers have been tweeting about the fact that they are commonly mistaken for secretaries when they go into work, and all other types of ways in which they're being discriminated in the office. But the demographics are shifting. So in 2010, 40% of video game players were women. That number has jumped to 47%, and it's expected that within the next 5 years, women will actually make up the majority of video game players. And so, of course, there is this response, and there's an effort to try to catch up on the part of game developers. But also another thing is that since the late 1990s, faster internet connections and better web applications have allowed developers to start building games online. And so people are now playing games that are often free or usually cost maybe $10 to actually buy the real game itself. So here's some of the ones that I was playing around high school and college. These tend to be the types of games that are more often appealing to those women who decide to play video games. Here are some of the ones that have come out in the last few years. These are also mobile games, so you can actually play these on your phone, which is a very popular way to play these games. So these are not the big AAA titles we're talking about here. These are not the high-powered, action-packed games. These are the types of things you play when you're sitting in the doctor's office or on the line at buying your groceries. But it's increasingly becoming the way in which people are playing games, and so games are becoming increasingly a bigger part of our lives. So where is all this leading? One of the things it's leading to is a new concept called gamification. And the idea behind gamification is adding game elements to non-game aspects of our lives. Now, in some sense, gamification has always been around. One of the common examples of gamification for example, are the use of badges. So if you complete a certain task, you get a badge for it, which is not all that on like the Boy Scouts, for example. You also advance to different levels once you've completed certain tasks and games, which is somewhat similar to when you go through school. An example of gamification being used to good effect in business is, does anybody here have a LinkedIn profile? So some of you will notice this bar over here actually tells you what percentage of your profile has been completed. This is a game element. And before they had that bar, they found that very few people were actually going the full steps to complete their profile. After they put that bar in, many more people, I think it was something 8 times the number of people, started completing their profile. So that feedback, that little reward, ends up being something that we end up chasing. Frequent flyer miles is another great example of gamification before it was called gamification. And to kind of show how people view it in a game-like way, they found that when they had the 1,000,000-mile mark, there was nothing above that. And they found that once people had broke through the 1,000,000-mile mark, people stopped accumulating miles. They already reached the level. What was the need to keep going? And so then immediately the airlines scrambled to create the 5,000,000-mile mark and the 10,000,000-mile mark because people needed to go to that next stage. And gamification is being considered as a new way to foster social change, education, personal goals, and even a way to get kids to do their chores. Gamification is also being used in science. So one example here is a game called Fold It. This is actually really more of a full-fledged game than an example of gamification, but scientists basically need to do different types of folding of proteins, and they could run through millions upon millions of different simulations and have the computer do it, but it actually turns out that human beings are pretty good at doing the folding themselves. And so they put this game out on the internet, and people can essentially fold the molecules on their own, and it's actually been quite beneficial in finding more effective ways of folding proteins. Another example is word games, where they have words associated with pictures, and this helps build an understanding for artificial intelligence about how to understand human language. And in your personal life, there's also websites like Fitocracy, which helps with exercise, helps people get to exercising, and there's also 2 that have to do with chores. So the idea is that if you can make chores fun, kids will be more likely to do chores. How successful this has actually been, I'm not really sure. But High Score House and Chore Wars are 2 games that both allow that. So there are some pitfalls of gamification that people have started to raise. One is that it just doesn't work. It doesn't really motivate people all that much. It doesn't really bring about the kind of change. That's been one criticism that's been leveled at it. Another is that it works too well. And some people say that it creates situations in which people are manipulated. A good example of that is Disney actually rolled out a gamification system for their hotels, where the workers, the cleaning folks at the hotel, were now being put onto this leaderboard. So those who cleaned most effectively were now on this board of having reached this particular achievement. And so rather than being a motivator, it actually proved to be a demotivator, because suddenly everyone was worried that they were going to be evaluated in some sort of way or criticized, and they would be stigmatized if they weren't on that leaderboard, and it actually made people work slower rather than faster. And there's also a concern that companies will start to use gamification as a way to get something for nothing. Give people different statuses and titles, and not really give them anything in terms of a material reward. So these are some examples of games that don't really have any violence. For the most part, they're different types of puzzle games, and I think they really highlight just how beautiful games can be. I mean, sure, there are some really ugly ones out there, and have very questionable morals and ethics behind them, but there are just so many that really just open up your experience of the world, and I'm glad to have them. I'm glad to be able to enjoy them. And if you have never played a video game before, I think it's something you should probably give a shot. And then the last thing I want to close with actually is just showing a couple of screenshots of people at different video game conventions and parties and dressing up as their characters. So that's it. Thank you very much.